My name is Josephine Anders, and I was 34 years old, 7 months pregnant, standing alone at the front of a rented event room with 22 guests and not a single member of my husband's family in the room. I want you to picture that room, because I have spent more time than I'd like to admit picturing it since. Pale blue and cream balloons arched over a table of gifts. A banner that said, "Welcome Baby Anders" in gold cursive letters my best friend Renata had spent an entire evening cutting out by hand. 22 guests, my own mother, my college roommates, co-workers from the elementary school where I taught 4th grade, all of them warm and generous and genuinely happy for me. And 3 empty chairs at the front table, reserved with little printed name cards. Diane, Robert, and Kimberly Anders, my mother-in-law, my father-in-law, and my sister-in-law, none of whom walked through that door. I found out an hour into the shower, checking my phone in the restroom because I'd felt the baby kick hard enough to need a minute alone, that all 3 of them were 200 miles away at my sister-in-law Kimberly's gender reveal party, standing in a field while pink smoke poured out of a cannon someone had rented for the occasion. My mother-in-law had posted a photo to the family group chat 40 minutes earlier. So thrilled to be here for this. Grandbaby number 3 is going to be a girl. We are over the moon. I stood in that small restroom for a long moment, gripping the edge of the sink, the sound of laughter and conversation drifting faintly through the door from the party still going on without me. I read the message 3 times, the way you read something hoping it will change if you look at it long enough. Grandbaby number 3. I was carrying grandbaby number 2, and in the caption of that photo, in the reflexive, careless math of a woman who had spent a decade quietly deciding which of her son's children mattered more, I had already been counted out. Before I tell you what happened after that, tell me where you're watching this from and what time it is where you are. I always like knowing that. Now let me take you back to the beginning, because you need to understand 10 years of small erosions before you can understand what my father-in-law had already done, years earlier, to make sure this particular humiliation would end up costing my in-laws something far larger than one uncomfortable afternoon. I met my husband, Marcus Anders, when I was 24, both of us newly hired at the same school district, him teaching high school science, me starting my first year in a 4th grade classroom 2 buildings over. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony his parents attended without much visible enthusiasm, and it was at that wedding, actually, that I first understood the shape of the family I was marrying into. I remember standing in the reception line while Diane greeted my own relatives, warm and gracious to everyone, the picture of a welcoming mother-in-law, and then turning to me with a smile that never quite reached her eyes, saying, "Well, Marcus certainly does things his own way, doesn't he?" A comment I spent the rest of that evening trying to decide whether to take as a compliment or something else. Entirely. I know now, with a decade of hindsight, exactly what she meant by it. The Anders family had money, not the kind that makes headlines, but the steady, generational kind, built by Marcus's grandfather in the construction supply business and carried forward, carefully, by his father, Robert. Robert Anders had grown the company modestly, but reliably over 4 decades, and somewhere along the way, the family had acquired a lake cabin 2 hours north of the city, a rustic, beautiful property that had become the center of the family's entire identity, the place every holiday gathering, every summer reunion, every important family conversation seemed to happen. Marcus has 1 sibling, his younger sister Kimberly, and from the very first family dinner I attended, I understood exactly where each of us stood in his mother's estimation. Kimberly had married into a wealthier family than ours, a man named Trevor, whose parents owned 3 car dealerships across the state, and Diane Anders, my mother-in-law, had never quite recovered from the thrill of that connection. Every conversation at every family gathering eventually circled back to Kimberly, her house, her vacations, her husband's business, the particular glow Diane reserved specifically for the daughter who had, in her eyes, married up. I want to be fair here, the way I've tried to be fair throughout everything that happened, because this isn't a story about Kimberly being some kind of villain either. Kimberly herself was, for the most part, simply oblivious, comfortable in the warmth that had always been extended to her without ever quite noticing that the same warmth wasn't being extended to me. It was Diane who kept score, carefully, deliberately, the way some people keep a ledger they never show anyone but never once stop updating. I remember the first Thanksgiving after Marcus and I married, sitting at the cabin's long dining table while Diane served the plates herself, starting with Robert, then Kimberly, then Trevor, then Marcus, and finally, after every other plate on the table had been filled, mine. It was such a small thing. I told myself, that first year, that it meant nothing, that I was reading intention into what was probably just the order she happened to reach around the table. By the fifth Thanksgiving, watching the same pattern repeat itself with the same quiet consistency, I understood it wasn't an accident at all. Marcus, for his part, spent most of our marriage genuinely not noticing, or noticing and choosing not to see it clearly, the way people do when confronting a parent's favoritism feels harder than simply absorbing it. I brought it up to him once, gently, during our third year of marriage, after a particularly painful Christmas where Diane had spent nearly the entire visit talking about a vacation house Kimberly and Trevor were considering, while my own promotion to lead teacher at my school, which I'd mentioned twice that same visit, went entirely unacknowledged. Marcus told me I was being sensitive, that his mother loved me, that this was simply how she was. And I remember the particular loneliness of hearing my own husband explain away something I had watched happen with my own eyes for 3 consecutive years. I stopped bringing it up directly after that Christmas, not because it stopped hurting, but because I learned, the way you learn most difficult lessons in a marriage, that repeating an observation to someone who isn't ready to hear it just teaches both of you to dread the conversation rather than actually resolving anything. I found other ways to cope instead, leaning more heavily on my own mother, on Renata, on the classroom full of children who, whatever else was happening in my life, never once made me feel like a second consideration. There is a particular resilience that builds in you when you learn to draw your sense of worth from places that will actually reflect it back to you honestly, and I built quite a lot of that resilience over those years, whether I wanted to or not. I want to tell you about Robert Anders now, because he is the other half of this story. The way Walter Marsh was the other half of a story very much like this one that I heard once from a woman named Eleanor, years before any of this happened to me. A story that, oddly enough, I found myself thinking about often in the months after my own father-in-law passed away. Robert was quieter than his wife, careful in a way that Diane never quite managed to be. He asked me real questions at family gatherings, about my classroom, about the reading program I'd developed for struggling students, about the actual substance of my life rather than the version of it that fit neatly into Diane's running commentary about which of her children's spouses had married better. Robert came to my classroom once, unannounced, on a random Tuesday afternoon during a school open house, standing quietly in the back of the room while I walked a group of parents through our reading corner, and afterward he told me, with a kind of genuine warmth I rarely heard from anyone in that family, that he wished more of the people in his own family had built something with their own 2 hands, the way I clearly had. I remember that visit vividly, how out of place he looked in his pressed slacks among the construction paper and reading nooks, and how genuinely delighted he seemed anyway, crouching down to look at a bulletin board where I'd pinned up my students' favorite books alongside their own handwritten reviews. He read every single one, I noticed, not just skimming the way most visiting parents did, but actually reading each child's careful, misspelled sentences about why they loved a particular story. "This is real work," he told me afterward, standing in the parking lot before he drove back to his office. I mean that as the highest compliment I know how to give. Most of what passes for accomplishment in my family isn't actually work at all. It's just inheritance wearing a nice suit. Robert's health began declining when I was 30, 4 years before that baby shower, a slow cardiac decline that the family discussed only in careful, clipped sentences at holiday gatherings, the way families sometimes discuss things they aren't ready to fully face. I visited him more often during those years than most of the rest of the family did, partly because Marcus and I lived closer, partly because something in me had come to genuinely treasure the quiet, unhurried conversations Robert and I had, usually sitting on the cabin's back porch overlooking the lake while everyone else busied themselves with whatever the weekend's activity happened to be. It was during one of those porch conversations, about 2 years before he died, that Robert told me what he had been quietly doing with the cabin. "I've been thinking about what happens to this place once I'm gone," he said, watching the water rather than looking at me directly, the way he tended to when a conversation mattered to him. "Diane wants to leave it to both kids jointly, the way you'd expect. But I've watched Kimberly and Trevor handle money for 15 years now, Josephine, and I don't trust either of them to keep this place standing 5 years past my funeral. Trevor's already floated the idea of selling it to fund some venture of his father's. Kimberly agreed with him at dinner last month like it was the most natural thing in the world. I told him, honestly, that it wasn't my place to have an opinion about how he divided his own property, and he waved that away with the particular impatience he reserved for statements he considered unnecessarily modest. "It's exactly your place," he said. "You're the only person in this family who has ever once asked me a question about this cabin that wasn't really a question about money. You asked me last summer how my father built the original dock. Nobody else in this family has ever once asked me that in 30 years of owning this place." He turned to look at me then, the same direct, unhurried look he'd given me the first time we met. "I'm restructuring the deed. Instead of leaving the cabin jointly to Marcus and Kimberly the way everyone assumes, I'm placing it into a family trust with a co-signer requirement on any future sale or transfer. Both of my children will remain beneficiaries, but no sale, no transfer, no major structural decision about this property can happen without a co-signature from a third party I'm naming as protector of the arrangement." He paused. "I'm naming you, Josephine. Not Marcus, not Kimberly. You." I sat with that for a long moment, the lake going gold in the late afternoon light, trying to understand exactly what he was telling me. "Robert, I'm not even blood. Diane would never understand why you chose me over your own children for something like this. That's exactly why it has to be you," he said. "My children have spent their whole lives being handed things without ever having to think carefully about what those things were worth. Diane taught them that showing up for the right people is the same as earning something, and I let her, because arguing with Diane has never once in 40 years of marriage been a fight worth having. But I'm an old man now, watching my daughter's husband circle this cabin like it's a line item on somebody else's balance sheet, and I need somebody in this family who actually understands what it means to build something and keep it standing. You built a reading program for children who were falling behind, Josephine, with almost no budget and no recognition, because you actually cared whether it worked. That's worth more to me than blood." The paperwork was finalized 18 months before Robert died, filed quietly with the county recorder, reviewed by an independent attorney he brought in specifically because he wasn't entirely confident the family's longtime lawyer, a man named Preston Yardley who golfed regularly with Diane's brother, would remain loyal to his actual wishes once he was no longer around to enforce them himself. The cabin's deed was placed into the Robert Anders Family Property Trust, with Marcus and Kimberly named as equal beneficiaries, but with any sale, transfer, refinancing, or structural modification requiring a co-signature from a named protector of the trust, me. I asked him once, during a follow-up conversation a few months after he first told me about the plan, why he hadn't simply left the cabin to Marcus alone if he trusted Marcus's judgment more than Kimberly's. He shook his head slowly. "Marcus doesn't have his sister's instinct for self-interest, which I love him for. But it also means he'd fold the first time Diane pressured him into agreeing with whatever Kimberly wanted. I need someone with a spine in this arrangement, Josephine, and my son, God love him, has never once in his life stood up to his mother about anything that actually mattered." I didn't argue with that assessment. I'd watched it play out myself for a decade by then. "They'll find out when they need to," Robert told me, the last time we had a truly clear conversation before his health declined too far. "And Josephine, when that day comes, I want you to promise me something. Don't use this to punish anyone. Use it to protect the place. The moment it becomes about revenge instead of protection, you become exactly the kind of person this family already thinks you aren't important enough to notice." Robert died in his sleep on a Sunday in early spring, 3.5 years before that baby shower. I sat near the back of the church during his funeral, watching Diane perform grief with the same practiced composure she brought to every social occasion in that family, watching Kimberly deliver a eulogy about her father's love of the lake that felt, to me, oddly disconnected from the actual man I had spent countless porch afternoons talking with. Marcus cried quietly beside me, real grief, and I held his hand through the entire service and said nothing yet about the folder Robert's independent attorney had delivered to our house 4 days earlier. I didn't do anything with the trust in the years immediately following Robert's death. I want to be honest about that, because I think it matters enormously to how this story ends. I filed the paperwork away in a locked drawer in my home office, told no one beyond Marcus, who I explained the full situation to gently over the course of several conversations, and continued living exactly the life I had been living, teaching 4th grade, attending the family gatherings Diane organized, absorbing the small, familiar slights that had defined my place in that family for a decade. Some part of me, I think, genuinely hoped I would never need to use the authority Robert had given me at all. But the slights didn't stop after Robert died. If anything, they got sharper, the way certain family dynamics tend to sharpen once the one steadying presence in the room is gone. Diane, without Robert's quiet influence tempering her, began organizing the cabin's summer schedule almost entirely around Kimberly's family's preferences, scheduling the best weekends for Kimberly and Trevor, offering Marcus and me the weeks that didn't conflict with anyone else's plans. When Marcus and I announced, 2 years after Robert's death, that we were expecting our first child, Diane's response, delivered over speakerphone while she was clearly distracted by something else in the background, was a brief congratulations followed immediately by an update on Kimberly's latest home renovation. Our first daughter, Adeline, was born the following spring. Diane visited the hospital for exactly 40 minutes, spent most of that time on her phone, and left before Marcus had even finished filling out the paperwork for Adeline's birth certificate, citing a lunch commitment with Kimberly that she'd apparently scheduled weeks earlier without adjusting it around the actual due date. I remember lying in that hospital bed, exhausted and sore, and holding my daughter for the first time, watching my mother-in-law gather her purse and coat with the same brisk efficiency she brought to leaving any gathering that wasn't sufficiently centered on her favorite child, and feeling something in my chest that wasn't quite anger yet, just a tired, familiar recognition of exactly where I stood. My own mother, by contrast, stayed 3 full days, sleeping in the uncomfortable hospital recliner rather than driving the 20 minutes home, holding Adeline through the middle of the night so I could sleep. And I remember thinking, watching her doze in that chair with my daughter cradled against her chest, how strange it was that the family I'd married into treated presence as something to be rationed carefully, while the family I'd come from simply understood, without ever needing to be asked, that presence was the whole point. I got pregnant with our second child, a boy we would eventually name Theodore when Adeline was 2 years old. That pregnancy was harder than the first, complicated enough in the early months that I spent several weeks on modified bed rest, teaching my classes remotely, worried enough about the baby's health that I genuinely didn't have the emotional bandwidth to notice, at first, how little concern Diane expressed about any of it. Marcus's texts to the family group chat updating everyone on my condition during the worst weeks were met, more often than not, with brief acknowledgments sandwiched between much longer updates about Kimberly's own pregnancy, announced just 6 weeks after mine, and immediately treated by Diane as the more significant event unfolding in the family that year. I want to walk you through the specific weeks leading up to that baby shower, because the pattern that had been building quietly for a decade finally became impossible for even Marcus to explain away. Renata, my best friend since college, organized the shower for a Saturday in late spring, sending out invitations 6 weeks in advance, including a formal invitation mailed directly to Diane, Robert, and Kimberly's addresses, the same way she'd mailed invitations to everyone else on the list. Diane confirmed her attendance in a brief text 3 weeks before the date. I remember feeling a small, cautious relief reading that confirmation, the same hopeful flicker I'd felt years earlier when she'd offered to help with something for once, before learning, inevitably, that the offer came with conditions I hadn't yet discovered. Kimberly's gender reveal, it turned out, had been scheduled for the exact same Saturday, nearly a month earlier. A fact Diane either hadn't noticed or hadn't cared enough to mention until 11 days before both events, when she sent a message to our family group chat explaining that she and Robert, meaning her husband, my father-in-law's name having been quietly passed to Diane's second husband. A man named Gerald, she'd remarried 2 years after Robert's death, would be attending Kimberly's celebration instead, since gender reveals only happened once and baby showers, in her words, were something families did for every child. I read that message 3 times before I fully absorbed what it meant. Something families did for every child, as though this were my second shower rather than my first, as though the distinction somehow made my celebration less significant simply because it wasn't a novel occasion for Diane to plan around. I didn't respond to the message. I let it sit, the same way I'd let a decade of small erosions sit without confrontation. And I focused instead on preparing for the day itself, telling myself, the way I always had, that showing up gracefully mattered more than making a scene about who else did or didn't. I want to walk you through the shower itself now, because the details matter more than the summary, the way they always do in stories like this one. The venue was a small event room above a bakery downtown, decorated in soft blues and creams, 22 guests filling the space with warmth that had nothing to do with the Anders family name at all. My own mother arrived early to help set up, along with Renata, who had spent an entire evening the week before cutting gold cursive letters out of cardstock for the welcome banner. My coworkers came, several of them bringing gifts from a classroom wish list I hadn't even shared publicly. Small, thoughtful things they'd noticed I needed during years of watching me spend my own money on supplies for my students. It was, in every way that actually mattered, a beautiful afternoon. I remember a particular moment, maybe 30 minutes in, watching my mother laugh with 2 of my college roommates over a game someone had organized, guessing the circumference of my belly with a length of ribbon, and feeling, despite the small ache of the 3 empty chairs at the front table, genuinely happy, surrounded by people who had shown up simply because they wanted to be there. My 3rd grade teaching partner, a woman named Cassandra, who had become one of my closest friends over the years, gave a small toast partway through, talking about how many of my own students' parents had specifically requested me as their child's teacher year after year, a detail that made me tear up in a way the pregnancy hormones only partially explained. An hour into the shower, I stepped away to the restroom, both because the baby had kicked hard enough to need a moment, and because some small, persistent part of me wanted to check my phone for a message from Diane explaining she was running late. What I found instead was the photo in the family group chat, pink smoke pouring out of a cannon in a field 200 miles away, Diane's caption glowing on my screen. So thrilled to be here for this. Grandbaby number 3 is going to be a girl. We are over the moon. I stood in that restroom for a long moment, one hand resting on my belly, feeling Theodore shift beneath my palm, and I understood, with a clarity that felt almost peaceful after a decade of confusion, exactly what I needed to do next. Not that day. Not in anger. But soon, and with the same quiet deliberateness Robert had shown me when he first told me about the trust on that porch overlooking the lake. I walked back out to my shower, smiled, opened gifts, thanked everyone individually the way my mother had raised me to, and didn't say a single word to anyone that afternoon about what I'd found in that group chat. Renata noticed something was off anyway, the way close friends always do, and pulled me aside near the end of the afternoon to ask quietly if I was all right. I told her the truth, briefly, and watched her face shift from concern to a controlled, protective anger on my behalf. "You have got to be kidding me," she said. "They didn't come to this because of a gender reveal party." "Josephine, I am so sorry." I told her I was all right, and mostly, standing there in that room full of people who had actually shown up for me, I meant it. Marcus found out that evening, when I finally showed him the message, sitting together on our couch after we'd put Adeline to bed. I watched something break open in his face as he read it, a kind of recognition I'd been waiting years for him to reach on his own. "Grandbaby number 3, he said quietly, reading the caption again. "She skipped your shower for a gender reveal and then referred to our baby like an afterthought in the same sentence." He looked up at me. "Josephine, I am so sorry." I should have said something years ago. I kept telling myself I was being fair to both of you, and I think, honestly, I was just avoiding a fight I didn't want to have with my mother. I told him, gently, that I appreciated him finally saying that, and I told him something else too, something I'd been holding on to for 3.5 years. I told him about the porch conversation with his father, about the trust, about the co-signer authority Robert had quietly built into the cabin's deed, specifically because he'd watched this exact pattern of favoritism unfolding for years before either of us fully admitted it out loud. Marcus sat very still, processing it the way I imagine anyone processes learning that their own father had, in his own quiet way, already seen everything clearly enough to act on it. I want to tell you what happened over the following months, because the family's attempt to sell the cabin, which arrived faster than I expected, only 12 weeks after that baby shower, is where everything Robert had built finally came into focus for everyone else in that family, whether they were ready for it or not. Trevor, Kimberly's husband, had apparently been pressing for months to liquidate the cabin and reinvest the proceeds into an expansion of his father's dealership network, a plan Kimberly had agreed to with the same easy comfort she brought to most decisions in her life. And Diane, freshly remarried and increasingly disengaged from the details of the estate Robert had left behind, had apparently signed off on the sale without ever fully reading the trust documentation that governed how the property could actually be transferred. A real estate agent listed the cabin quietly, off-market, at a price well below what the property was genuinely worth, the kind of number you accept when you want something gone quickly rather than sold carefully. I found out about the listing from Marcus, who had learned about it almost by accident, overhearing Kimberly mention a closing date during what was supposed to be an unrelated phone call about Adeline's upcoming birthday. He called me from his car in the school parking lot, his voice tight in a way I rarely heard from him. "Josephine, they're selling the cabin." Kimberly just mentioned a closing date like it was already decided. "I don't think anyone even remembers your name is on the trust." I want to be honest about what I felt hearing that, because I think it matters more than any dramatic reaction I could describe. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt, mostly, the same tired clarity I'd felt standing in that restroom during my own baby shower, watching pink smoke billow across a screen 200 miles away. I called the trust's independent attorney, a careful, unhurried woman named Marisol Denby, who confirmed everything I already suspected. The sale could not legally proceed without my co-signature as protector of the trust. Diane and Kimberly's signatures, no matter how many times they were affixed to whatever paperwork Trevor's real estate agent had drawn up, meant nothing at all under the terms Robert had established years earlier. Marisol and I scheduled a formal meeting with the family, the way the trust required whenever the protector's authority needed to be formally exercised, held at Marisol's downtown office rather than the cabin itself, a choice I made deliberately, wanting the conversation to happen somewhere that felt like business rather than family, the same way I imagine Robert would have wanted it handled. I want to walk you through that meeting now, because it is the moment this entire story has been building toward. Diane arrived first, dressed sharply, her jaw set in a way that told me she already suspected something was wrong even before Marisol began speaking. Kimberly came next, flustered and confused, glancing repeatedly at her phone as though checking whether Trevor had sent her any last-minute instructions. Trevor himself arrived with his own attorney, a young man clearly unprepared for whatever he was about to walk into. Marcus sat beside me, holding my hand, the way he had every appointment since the night I'd first told him the full story. Marisol began by confirming the basic structure of the trust for the record. The deed transfer Robert had completed years earlier, the protector role, the specific requirement that any sale or transfer receive formal co-signature approval. Trevor's attorney tried, weakly, to argue that the provision seemed unusually restrictive and might not be enforceable. Marisol simply slid across a copy of the independent legal review Robert had commissioned at the time, along with the recorded deed itself, filed with the county years before any listing agreement had ever been drafted. This document was reviewed by an attorney with no connection to the family, Marisol said, her voice calm and precise. Mr. Anders was very deliberate about that. He wanted to make certain nobody could later argue the arrangement was the product of undue influence or family pressure. It is, by every reasonable legal standard, enforceable exactly as written. Diane's composure cracked before Marisol had even finished laying out the documents. "This is absurd," she said, her voice rising in a way I had rarely heard from her. "Robert would never have done something like this without telling me. You're not even blood, Josephine. You have no right to stand in the way of what's best for this family." "Robert did tell me," I said, keeping my voice as level as I could manage, the way I had promised myself I would if this moment ever came. 3.5 years ago, on the cabin's back porch, because he'd spent years watching how this family actually treated each other and decided somebody needed to be able to protect what he'd built, even after he was gone. I didn't ask for this authority, Diane. He gave it to me because he trusted me more than he trusted anyone else in this family to actually care whether that cabin survived. Kimberly, to her credit, looked genuinely stricken rather than defensive. The particular expression of someone realizing, all at once, how much of her family's dynamics she had simply never noticed because they had always worked in her favor. "I didn't know any of this," she said quietly. "Trevor told me the sale made sense financially. I never even read the deed paperwork myself." "That," I said, as gently as I could manage, "is exactly the problem your father was worried about." Trevor's attorney asked for time to review the documentation further, the standard request in a moment like that one, and Marisol told him, of course, take whatever time you need, though the underlying facts weren't going to change no matter how long they took to review them. The meeting ended not with shouting, though it had come close, but with the particular quiet of people finally understanding that a decision they'd assumed was already settled had never actually been theirs to make alone. I want to tell you what happened in the months that followed, because the aftermath mattered just as much as that conference room did. The sale collapsed within weeks. Once it became clear, no co-signature was forthcoming. Trevor, frustrated and embarrassed in front of his own father, blamed Kimberly publicly for not having read the trust paperwork before agreeing to the listing, a comment that led to what I understand, through Marcus, was the first real argument of Kimberly's marriage, one she apparently didn't back down from the way she usually did. Something in Kimberly seemed to shift after that meeting, a small, quiet reckoning of her own, watching for the first time how easily she had let other people make decisions on her behalf, simply because it had always been easier than paying close attention. Diane did not speak to me for nearly 5 months. She attended one family gathering during that stretch, a birthday dinner for Adeline that fall, sitting rigidly through the entire meal and directing most of her conversation toward Marcus rather than me, though I noticed, for the first time in a decade, that she also spent a genuine 10 minutes talking directly to Adeline about her drawings. A small, ordinary kindness that felt, oddly, like the beginning of something rather than nothing at all. I remember watching that exchange from across the room. Diane crouched down beside Adeline's booster seat, asking careful questions about a crayon drawing of what appeared to be a purple dog, and feeling a strange mixture of things at once, some old, familiar hurt that it had taken all of this for her to offer my daughter that kind of attention, and something softer underneath it, a small, cautious hope that maybe, slowly, something in this family was actually beginning to shift rather than simply repeating itself the way it always had. Theodore was born that winter, 5 months after the trustee meeting, a healthy, easy delivery that felt, after everything, like its own quiet vindication. Diane visited the hospital for a full 2 hours this time, held her grandson for nearly the entire visit, and left, for once, not because of a competing commitment with Kimberly, but simply because visiting hours had ended. It wasn't an apology. I want to be honest about that. But it was, I think, the beginning of Diane finally understanding that the family she'd spent a decade curating around her own preferences had nearly cost her something she genuinely valued, the actual, ongoing presence of her grandchildren in her life. I still teach 4th grade. The reading program I built years ago, the one Robert once told me he admired more than almost anything else in the family, has since been adopted by 2 other schools in the district, a small, steady legacy that has nothing to do with the Anders name at all. Though I've come to understand, in the years since Robert's death, that he was the one person in that family who always understood exactly what that kind of legacy was actually worth. The cabin still stands, exactly the way Robert wanted it to, jointly owned by Marcus and Kimberly, protected by a piece of paperwork neither of them fully understood existed until the moment it mattered most. We still gather there most summers, all of us now, Diane and Gerald, Kimberly and Trevor and their children, Marcus and me and Adeline and Theodore. The dynamics still imperfect, still occasionally tense, but slowly, unmistakably, more honest than they used to be. I think often about that porch conversation, about Robert watching the lake rather than looking at me directly while he explained what he'd already decided to do. I think about how he spent decades watching his own family without ever quite trusting any of them, except for the daughter-in-law his wife had spent a decade quietly overlooking, with the thing he cared most about protecting. I also think, more than I probably should, about Kimberly, about the quiet conversation we finally had, just the two of us, at the cabin the following summer, sitting on that same back porch while our children played near the water. She apologized to me that afternoon, genuinely, in a way that surprised me with how much it actually meant. "I never once thought about how it looked from where you were standing," she said. "I just always assumed everyone got what I got, because that's all I ever knew to look for." I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I told her, honestly, that I didn't think she'd ever meant any of it maliciously, that some kinds of blindness aren't chosen so much as inherited, passed down the way a family passes down anything else nobody ever bothers to examine closely. We're not as close as sisters are supposed to be, even now, but we're honest with each other in a way we never managed to be before, and I've come to believe that honesty, even imperfect, is worth more than the comfortable silence we used to share instead. Here's what I want you to take from this, if you take anything at all. Being overlooked by the people who are supposed to love you doesn't mean you're actually invisible. Sometimes the person paying the closest attention to your worth isn't the person you'd expect, and sometimes that quiet attention becomes, years later, the very thing that protects everything that matters, long after the people who overlooked you have forgotten they ever had the chance to see you clearly on their own. That's my story. If you've ever stood in a room full of empty chairs reserved for people who chose somewhere else to be, I hope you find your own version of that porch conversation, whatever form it takes. And if this reminded you that quiet attention is its own kind of love, worth giving and worth watching for, I hope you remember that today. Thank you for listening.